Somewhere around the year 1300, across a stretch of the American Southwest larger than most people can picture, something shifted. Communities that had been building, farming, trading and burying their dead in the same landscape for generations simply stopped being there. Not slowly fading over centuries the way some civilizations do, not replaced by another group moving in and taking over, just gone quiet. The fires stopped burning, the plazas emptied out, rooms that took tremendous effort to carve into cliffsides or stack up stone by stone on open mesas sat there, waiting for people who never came back. When most people hear a story like that, their mind goes somewhere dramatic. A plague sweeping through in days, a sudden catastrophic war. One terrible night when everything ended at once. That image of civilization snuffed out like a candle is compelling, and it's been repeated so many times that it's become almost the default way people talk about this. But here's the thing, the evidence doesn't quite let us say that. Archaeology works in layers and in silences, and what it shows here is more complicated and, honestly, more interesting than any single catastrophic moment. What we can say is that by sometime around 1300, the great population centres of the northern southwest had lost their people. What we can't say, at least not with certainty, is exactly how fast it happened or why. The places we're talking about are not small or forgettable. Picture Mesa Verde, where people built entire communities into the faces of canyon walls, rooms and kivas and towers tucked into alcoves hundreds of feet above the canyon floor, constructed with a precision that still makes modern visitors stop and stare. Move east, and you're in the shadow of Chaco Canyon, a place that had already served as something like a regional hub, a centre of ceremony, trade, and architectural ambition for centuries before this moment. Look toward the west and south, and you find the Kayenta region, another dense pocket of communities whose people left behind pottery and architecture distinct enough to trace across the landscape. Then there's the broader Colorado Plateau, an enormous high desert territory where hundreds of villages, large and small, were all experiencing versions of the same story at roughly the same time. These weren't isolated outposts. They were connected by roads, by shared beliefs, by the movement of goods and people and ideas across distances that should feel impossible for a society without wheels or horses as we typically imagine them. When communities in this network started going quiet, it wasn't happening in a vacuum. Something was moving through the system, or rather several somethings stacking on top of each other in ways that are hard to fully untangle even now. That's the question that drives everything that follows. Not just what happened, but what combination of pressures, environmental, social, political, spiritual, reaches a threshold where people who have invested generations into a place decide that staying is no longer an option. Because that's what this was, most likely. A decision, or thousands of decisions made by families and communities in response to a world that had changed faster than they could absorb. The homes they left weren't accidents. The cities they built weren't failures. Something made staying impossible, or at least made leaving feel necessary. Figuring out what that something was, or more accurately, what those somethings were, is one of the most genuinely unresolved questions in American archaeology. Before we go any further, I want to know where you are right now. Drop a comment and tell me what city or country you're listening from, and what time it is there. There's something I find quietly remarkable about people scattered across the world, at completely different hours, tuning into a mystery about a place most of them have never stood in. It feels appropriate somehow, for a story about distance and movement and what it means to leave a place behind. Stay with this, because we're just getting started. Before we go any further into the story, we need to pause on a word, because abandoned is one of those terms that sounds precise, but actually carries a lot of assumptions inside it. When archaeologists use it, they're usually describing a specific technical observation, a site that was once occupied and then wasn't. But that simple sentence collapses an enormous range of different human experiences into one flat word, and some of what gets lost in that collapse matters quite a bit for understanding what actually happened here. Archaeologists working in this region tend to separate out at least a few distinct processes that can all look similar from the outside. There's abandonment in the narrow sense, a site or structure being vacated, often fairly quickly. Then there's depopulation, which refers to a region losing population, without specifying where that population went or how fast. Then there's migration, which implies movement with a destination, people choosing to go somewhere rather than simply leave. And then there's reorganization, which is maybe the most important concept of all. The idea that a society can restructure itself, shift its settlement patterns, redistribute its people across the landscape in ways that look like disappearance from the perspective of any single place, but actually represent a community transforming rather than ending. These four things are genuinely different processes. They have different causes, different timelines, and different implications for what happened to the people involved. Treating them all as abandoned flattens the story before we've even started telling it. The reason that distinction matters here is that the evidence in many places points more toward reorganization and migration than towards simple disappearance. People didn't evaporate. They went somewhere. In some cases we can even follow them, which we'll get to later. But the word abandoned keeps getting used because it's accurate from one angle. The sites are empty. And because something about the image of empty rooms is genuinely haunting, and haunting makes for compelling storytelling. Just keep in mind as we go through this that empty rooms are the beginning of the question, not the answer. Now, about the dating. This is where the story gets technically complicated in ways that really do matter. When we say around 1300, what do we actually mean, and how confident should we be? The short answer is that our confidence varies quite a bit depending on which site we're talking about and what kind of evidence survives there. The most reliable dating tool available for this region is dendrochronology, tree ring dating. The southwest is one of the best places in the world for this technique because ancient wood survives well in the dry climate, and because researchers over decades have built up a detailed master chronology of ring patterns stretching back thousands of years. When a wooden beam from a construction event is well preserved, dendrochronology can sometimes tell you not just the year the tree was cut but the season. That's an extraordinary level of precision. If you find a roof beam that was cut in the spring of 1278, you know that room was being built or repaired in 1278. But there are limits. Tree ring dates tell you when wood was cut, not necessarily when a room was last used. People reused old beams. They repaired structures with salvaged timber. A beam dated to 1250 might be sitting in a wall that was actually built or rebuilt decades later. And more importantly for our purposes, tree ring dates cluster around construction events, not abandonment events. People don't usually build something when they're leaving, so the last construction date at a site gives you a floor, a point before which the site was certainly still occupied, but it doesn't tell you how much longer people stayed after the building stopped. Radiocarbon dating covers gaps where wood doesn't survive, but it comes with its own uncertainty ranges. A radiocarbon date on organic material from a hearth might give you a range of 50 or 100 years with a certain probability. That's useful for broad patterns, but imprecise for tracking events that might have unfolded over decades. Ceramic sequences offer another layer. The types of pottery people made and used changed over time in ways that are well documented enough to serve as a rough chronological guide. Find a particular style of black-on-white ware, and you can say with reasonable confidence you're looking at a certain general period. But ceramic sequences have their own fuzzy edges and regional variations. What all of this means practically is that when we say things happened around 1300, we're describing a zone of probability, not a fixed point. For some sites, the evidence is tight enough to say the occupation ended sometime in the last 2 or 3 decades of the 1200s. For others, we're working with a range that spans 50 years or more. The overall pattern of regional depopulation does cluster in a recognizable way, around the late 1200s and early 1300s. But the precision we might wish for, the ability to say this village emptied in the summer of 1299, is mostly beyond our reach, which brings us to the question of what archaeologists actually look for when they want to understand how a place ended, because the physical signature of a departure contains information, if you know how to read it. Sealed rooms are one of the most telling things a site can offer. When people close off a room deliberately, fill a doorway, cap an opening, it suggests intentionality. They're not fleeing in a panic, they're wrapping things up. Sometimes rooms were sealed with objects still inside them, ceramic vessels, grinding stones, items that seem valuable enough that you'd expect people to take them if they were moving permanently and had time to pack. When you find that kind of assemblage, it raises a question. Were these offerings left behind as part of a closing ceremony? Were they too heavy to carry? Were they items the people expected to come back for someday? The presence of left-behind goods can suggest a planned departure, but it doesn't tell you whether the plan was to return or to leave forever. Burned structures complicate the picture in a different way. Fire at archaeological sites can mean several things: accidental destruction, deliberate burning as part of abandonment ritual, or violent attack. Distinguishing between these possibilities requires close analysis of where the burning started, how it spread, what was inside the structure when it burned, and what condition the human remains found there are in, if any are present at all. Burned structures without human remains, and without the kind of scattered, broken material you'd expect from a violent event, might point toward a ritual closure. People burning a structure as a way of ending it properly, releasing it, marking it as finished. Some researchers argue this was a meaningful practice in this region. Others are more cautious about reading symbolism into what might simply be fire. Here's the thing about gradual departure that becomes important once you understand the dating limitations. A community that loses households slowly over 20 or 30 years, one family leaves after a bad harvest, another follows relatives south, a third leaves when the community leadership fractures, can look, from the vantage point of 7 centuries later, almost identical to a community that cleared out in a single season. The grain that's still in storage, the tools still on the floor, those don't necessarily tell you whether the last person left in 1280 or 1295 or 1302, or whether they left alone after watching their neighbours go one by one, or as part of a coordinated group movement. The silence left behind is the same either way. This is one of the reasons why the overnight framing and how people talk about this region is both understandable and slightly misleading. When you compress multiple decades of gradual change into a single historical moment, as we almost inevitably do when we're summarizing, you get something that looks abrupt even if the lived experience was incremental. Families making difficult decisions over years, communities trying different strategies before finally giving up on a place, leaders negotiating what it would mean to leave. All of that messy human process can vanish into a phrase like, "They were gone by 1300. So here's the approach this script is going to take. We're going to follow the evidence first, what's actually in the ground, what the dating actually supports, what the physical record actually shows, before moving into interpretation. We're going to sit with uncertainty where it's real rather than smoothing it over, and we're going to resist the pull toward any single dramatic explanation, not because dramatic explanations are always wrong, but because the evidence here keeps pointing toward complexity, multiple pressures, overlapping causes, human decisions made under conditions we can partially reconstruct but never fully know. The empty rooms are real, the silence is real. What we're going to try to do is understand it honestly. To understand why the departure matters, you first have to understand what was actually being departed from. Because these weren't small camps or scattered seasonal shelters. They were cities, communities with architecture that required coordination, planning, and a level of social organization that doesn't just appear overnight and doesn't disappear from the historical record without leaving a mark on the people who came after. The Mesa Verde region, a broad area centered on the plateau country where present-day Colorado, Utah, Arizona, and New Mexico meet, had been occupied for centuries before the events of the late 1200s. People had been farming this landscape, building on it, reading its soils and its water and its rhythms, long before the dramatic cliff dwellings that made this region famous were ever constructed. The cliff dwellings are the part everyone pictures. Cliff palace, longhouse, balcony house, structures tucked into massive sandstone alcoves beneath overhanging canyon walls, built with such precision that their walls still stand. They became iconic almost the moment outside explorers first laid eyes on them in the late 19th century, and that iconography has shaped how we think about this civilization ever since, sometimes helpfully, sometimes not. The question worth asking first is why the cliffs at all? People in this region had been living on the mesa tops for generations, farming the upland soils, building in the open. The shift toward cliff-based construction represents a genuine change in strategy, and researchers have offered several overlapping explanations for it, none of which is sufficient on its own. Water was almost certainly part of it. Many of the alcoves where cliff dwellings were built sit directly below seeps and springs, places where groundwater works its way through the sandstone and emerges at the canyon wall. In a landscape where water availability was never guaranteed, building close to a reliable water source wasn't just convenient, it was prudent. The microclimates in the alcoves offered another practical advantage. Canyon walls absorb solar heat through the day and release it slowly, keeping sheltered spaces warmer in winter than the exposed mesa top. In a region where growing seasons were already tight, a few extra degrees of warmth in a sheltered location wasn't trivial. Defense is the explanation that gets the most attention, and the archaeology does support it, at least partially. Many cliff dwellings are genuinely difficult to reach. Some require ladders or hand and toe holds cut into the rock face. The approaches are narrow and exposed. If you wanted to make a community hard to attack, putting it in a cliff alcove above a canyon floor achieves that. But researchers are careful not to let the defensive explanation do too much work, because people were also making choices about community visibility, social identity, and what it meant to be seen. There's an argument that architecture in this period was doing signalling work, that large, elaborate, prominently placed structures were broadcasting something about the communities that built them. The cliff dwellings aren't hidden. Some of them are dramatically visible from the canyon floor below. That visibility is worth thinking about alongside the defensibility. Walk through one of these sites and the evidence of daily life is everywhere, if you know what you're looking at. Storage rooms packed tight into the back of the alcove, sealed against rodents and moisture. Manos and metates, the handstones and grinding slabs for processing corn, worn smooth from years of use. Ceramic vessels in forms that tell you about cooking practices, water carrying and trade. Some of the pottery found in Mesa Verde contexts was made locally, and some of it came from surprisingly far away. Evidence of exchange networks that connected these communities to a much wider world. Out on the mesa tops, the farming infrastructure is visible too. Check dams built across small drainages to slow water and trap soil. Terraces cut into slopes. Evidence of deliberate landscape management by people who understood their environment in detail and worked hard to coax productivity out of it. The population trajectory leading up to the late 1200s is striking. Numbers are always approximate in archaeology, but the general picture shows population growing through the 1200s and concentrating into larger and larger communities. Sites that might have held a few dozen people in an earlier period were being replaced by or consolidated into villages of hundreds. Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, which we'll return to, held somewhere in the range of several hundred rooms. Some of the large cliff dwellings represent similar concentrations of people and construction effort. This wasn't a scattered, thin population. By the mid to late 1200s, significant numbers of people were living in relatively dense communities in ways that created new social pressures alongside the benefits of cooperation. And then the architecture starts telling a different story. Researchers who study settlement patterns closely have noted changes in the late 1200s that suggest something shifting in the social environment. Towers appear, their function debated but their presence notable. Doorways get smaller and more defensible. Some sites show evidence of being walled in ways that restrict access. The concentration into larger villages, which might initially have been driven by cooperation and shared resources, may have also been driven by the need for security in numbers. Communities pulling together not just to farm better, but to protect what they had. These are stress signals, not proof of catastrophe, not evidence of a single cause, but the physical signature of a society making choices that reflect pressure. People don't redesign their architecture toward defensibility when everything is fine. They don't consolidate into dense communities if the benefits of that consolidation don't outweigh the costs. The strain on local resources, the social friction of close quarters, the management challenges of larger groups. The buildings themselves are asking questions that the people who built them were clearly also asking. The answers they found, or didn't find, are what drove everything that came after. Those questions didn't start in the cliffs. To see the full shape of what was happening in the 1200s, you have to look back a couple of centuries and a couple hundred miles to the southeast, to another place that would also end up largely empty, Chaco Canyon. For a long stretch of time, roughly between the 800s and 1100s, Chaco was one of the most ambitious experiments in community on the entire continent. Not the only one, not the unquestioned capital of some unified ancestral Pueblo empire, but a powerful node in a landscape of many nodes. A canyon in what is now northwestern New Mexico, lined with massive masonry buildings, archaeologists call great houses. These weren't just big versions of ordinary homes. Some had hundreds of rooms, multiple stories, thick walls laid up in intricate stonework, and huge ceremonial spaces called great kivas. They were overbuilt for the number of people who actually lived in them full-time. That mismatch is one of the clues that Chaco wasn't just a town. It looks more like a combination of pilgrimage center, storage hub, political venue, and ritual stage. From Chaco, roads radiated out into the surrounding region. Straight roads. So straight that in some stretches they cut right across the natural contours of the land instead of snaking around hills or following drainages the way you'd expect if the only goal was hauling goods efficiently. You can still trace some of them on aerial imagery, engineered lines heading toward outlying great houses miles away, tying distant communities back to this canyon. Along those roads and beyond them, goods moved. Turquoise, shell, macaw feathers, copper bells, distinctive styles of pottery. Some of it came from hundreds of miles away, moving through hands and relationships that reached well beyond the Colorado Plateau. Food may have moved too, especially at certain times of year, and with the movement of objects came the movement of stories, songs, ritual knowledge, obligations. Chaco's influence probably didn't look like a modern state with borders and direct control. It's better imagined as a web of obligations and opportunities. Come here for ceremony, bring offerings, receive gifts, reaffirm alliances. That kind of system leaves a cultural wake, even after Chaco's great houses saw their peak construction and then started to lose their central pull in the 1100s. The people didn't forget what it meant to be part of something that stretched beyond the next canyon. The roads might have gone quiet, but the idea of long-distance connection didn't just vanish. The memory of how to organize labor for big projects, how to coordinate multiple communities for shared ceremonies, how to host and be hosted. Those habits of mind survived the buildings that first crystallized them. When populations later swelled in regions like Mesa Verde, they were doing it in a world that had already been shaped by that earlier experiment. Some of the migration routes that became important in the late 1200s trace paths that had been meaningful for generations, corridors that once linked outlier communities to Chaco, or later linked Chaco's successor centers to smaller villages. As people decided where to go, they weren't moving across blank space. They were moving along remembered pathways toward places where kin already lived, where ceremonies had been held, where alliances could be renewed or renegotiated. At the same time, the overall pattern was shifting. The Chaco era's wide, open network, big nodes, long roads, broadly shared styles of pottery and architecture, gave way over the 1100s and 1200s to something more fragmented and localized. You still see interaction across regions, but you also see communities increasingly investing in their immediate surroundings. More emphasis on local water control features, more site layouts that make sense if you're worried about the next valley over, not the distant canyon down the road. More architecture that can be defended, less that's designed to impress visitors arriving from far away. In some areas, power that had been concentrated in places like Chaco seems to disperse into multiple smaller centers. Different regions develop their own architectural signatures, their own ways of organizing villages, their own ritual focal points. Alliances still matter, but they're negotiated in a world that feels less like one big web and more like many smaller overlapping ones. By the time you get to 1300, you're looking at the tail end of this long process. The abandonment of places like Mesa Verde isn't a sudden break with a stable past. It's the last visible move in a centuries-long rebalancing of how people related to each other across this landscape. Networks had been stretching and sagging, tightening in some places and fraying in others for generations. The shift from sprawling integrated systems to defensive, place-focused communities wasn't an overnight reaction. It was the background trend. So when entire regions finally seem to empty out, they're doing so in a world already accustomed to movement, to reorganization, to the rise and fall of centers. Chaco's shadow is there in the routes people chose, in the memories and obligations that tugged them one direction instead of another. But the decision to leave Mesa Verde behind was made in a different kind of world than the one that built Chaco's great houses. A world where survival and security were being recalculated at the scale of the canyon, the spring, and the fortified village. If you zoom in from that big shifting web of roads and alliances down to a single canyon, the story starts to sound a lot more basic. It starts to sound like, did it rain enough this year to keep people alive? One of the strangest things about this mystery is that the sky has left us a kind of ledger, not in written records but in wood. Many of the beams used in great houses, towers and cliff dwellings were cut from trees that recorded every year of their lives in growth rings. Narrow rings in dry years, fatter ones in wet years, stacked up like a barcode of good times and bad. Dendrochronologists spent decades learning how to read that barcode, By overlapping patterns from living trees, dead snags, archaeological timbers, and even driftwood, they built a calendar that runs back thousands of years. When you drop the dates of beams from Mesa Verde, Chaco, and other ancestral Pueblo sites into that timeline, a pattern starts to emerge. The late 1200s jump out as a cluster of bad news. Between roughly 1276 and 1299, the tree rings across much of the northern southwest get consistently skinny. That interval is often called the Great Drought. It wasn't 30 years of totally rainless sky, but it was an extended stretch where the odds of decent rainfall were tilted against you again and again. Short stunted growth in trees means shorter growing seasons, fewer reliable summer storms, and soils that don't hold moisture the way they usually do. For people farming maize on marginal land, that kind of shift isn't just an inconvenience, it's a narrowing of the possible future. Maize needs a specific window of warmth and moisture to germinate, grow tall, tassel, and fill out with kernels. If the summer rains come late, or not at all, plants might sprout and then wither. If spring is too dry, seeds might not germinate evenly. If a hard frost hits too early in the fall, ears that looked promising can be frozen before they're fully mature. In a good year, surplus grain fills storage rooms and subterranean pits. Those reserves are what smooth out the bumps, turning a bad harvest into a lean winter instead of a deadly one. In a run of bad years, storage starts to flip from safety net into source of risk. Grain can spoil if it's stored too long in marginal conditions. Rodents find it. Mold creeps in if you have to seal it too tight against pests. Each failed harvest means you're dipping deeper into what you thought was your margin for error. Archaeologists looking at maize cobs from this period see signs of stress. Smaller kernels, more variability in size, indications that people were eating a higher percentage of what they grew instead of replanting only the best. It's the biological fingerprint of people pushing a system harder than it was designed to go. And water wasn't just something that fell from the sky. It was something people tried to catch, guide, and stretch. Across the mesas and canyons, you see an intricate vocabulary of water control features. Check dams built across small drainages to slow runoff, so it could soak into fields instead of tearing soil away. Low stone alignments and terraces to direct sheet wash across planted plots. Reservoirs in natural depressions, sometimes lined or modified to hold seasonal water. Communities concentrated near springs and seeps that offered relatively reliable flow even when surface water disappeared. Every one of those features is a statement about how tightly water and community were braided together. A spring isn't just a resource, it's a reason for a village to exist in that exact spot. A reservoir isn't just a pond, it's the product of coordinated labour, planning and maintenance year after year. But they're also vulnerable in specific ways. A spring can dwindle or go salty if the water table drops, if sediment chokes its outlet, or if too many people and animals trample its catchment. A reservoir can silt in faster during drought, as sparse vegetation fails to hold soil on the slopes above. Check dams are only as good as the storms that feed them. A slight shift in where summer monsoons track can mean your carefully engineered system is now catching nothing. Dendrochronology tells us the late 1200s were dry on average, but it also reveals something just as important: variability. Big swings from year to year. A terrible decade punctuated by the occasional okay season. That kind of inconsistency is brutal for planning. You can't count on a steady trickle. You're gambling every planting season, and that variability didn't hit every place the same way. The Southwest is a patchwork of microclimates. A village tucked under a north-facing cliff with deep soils and a dependable seep might scrape by, while a settlement only a few miles away, on thinner soils and a less reliable drainage, tips into crisis. Some pockets along major rivers could still coax crops from floodplain fields, while upland dry farms failed repeatedly. When archaeologists map out where people stayed a little longer and where they left earlier, those patterns line up in suggestive ways with where water and rain held out just a bit better. In some areas, you see population thinning first on the most marginal lands, with people consolidating near better springs and more resilient farming zones, before even those places finally see large-scale departures. That's where drought stops looking like a neat single cause and starts looking like a relentless pressure multiplier. Extended dryness and unpredictable rain don't explain ritual changes, new defensive architecture, or shifting alliances by themselves, but they make every other problem sharper. A feud with another village is more dangerous when nobody has surplus grain to offer as compensation. A leadership dispute is harder to smooth over when the leaders can't sponsor feasts or guarantee food. Decisions about whether to stay put or move away become questions not just about belief or politics, but about whether your particular canyon's patchy rains and tired soils can realistically keep your children fed. By the end of the 1200s, many communities weren't just living with drought. They were making choices inside a landscape that had been regraded by it, where every calculation about safety, kinship, and tradition was being filtered through the simple, unforgiving question, is there enough water here for us to keep going? Water was only one side of the problem. The other side was what that water was falling on, and what kind of landscape was left to catch it. Maize doesn't grow in landscape. It grows in specific, finite patches of dirt that hold a particular balance of sand, silt, clay, organic matter, and nutrients. Those good patches are not everywhere. They're on certain benches, certain toe slopes, certain pockets of deeper, finer soil that you can work with a digging stick and coax into productivity. For centuries, people in the northern southwest knew where those pockets were and how to use them. They rotated fields, shifted planting spots, and moved between farmsteads and village centres to spread the load. But dry farming maize at high elevation is inherently pushing the envelope. You need the right storms at the right time, and you need soils that can hang on to that moisture long enough for roots to find it. Now imagine farming those same plots over and over, generation after generation, in a climate that's tilting drier. Every harvest takes nutrients out of the ground. Every tilling event, every time you open that soil up, you expose it to wind and sudden summer downpours that can carry the fine particles away. If you have the labour and the organic matter, you can add mulch, manure, or household waste to rebuild fertility. There's evidence that people did exactly that in some places. Thick, dark anthrasols full of ash, broken pottery, and organic debris built up near long-lived settlements. But not every household had easy access to large herds for manure. Not every slope could be terraced or armoured with rock, and we'll just move to a fresh field becomes a harder solution when there are more people and fewer unclaimed good spots. Soil depletion doesn't look dramatic in the archaeological record. There's no great erosion layer of 1287 that neatly pins the story down. Instead, you see subtle things. Thinner, rockier deposits in fields that once held deeper topsoil. Check dams and terraces built further and further upslope, trying to stabilize ground that's already trying to slide or blow away. Pollen sequences that show increasing amounts of weedy, disturbed ground plants. Indications that people were extending farming onto more marginal, sloping or shallow soils because the best places were already tired or taken. And then there's the wood. Those great houses in Chaco, the big kivas, the tall, elegant cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde. None of them are just stone. They're timber projects. Roofs, floors, door lintels, support beams, ladders. On top of that framework you have the daily burn of cooking fires, heating fires, and the hotter, sustained fires needed to harden clay into usable pottery. In the 11th century, when Chaco was booming, a lot of that timber was hauled in from faraway mountain ranges. Dendrochronology has traced beams to stands dozens of miles away. That tells you two things. Big communities could mobilize people and pack animals to move wood over long distances, and the closer, more convenient forests were already being cut heavily enough that people looked elsewhere. Fast forward to the late 1200s and the situation isn't simpler. You've had centuries of steady demand. Even in smaller, more scattered settlements, wood use adds up. You don't need modern deforestation for this to bite. You just need the best groves of straight, mature trees within easy walking distance to be thinned out or gone. As forests are cut back, runoff changes. Less canopy and ground cover mean more water hitting bare soil, more erosion, and flashier floods that tear through fields instead of soaking in. Fuel gathering gets harder. Instead of a quick trip outside the village, people may be walking farther, carrying heavier loads of lower quality wood and brush. Firing pottery becomes more expensive in labour terms. Construction projects have to make do with smaller, twistier beams or more intricate joinery. There are signs of people adjusting. You see careful coppicing-like cuts on some stumps, suggesting that people were harvesting in ways that allowed regrowth. You see architecture that uses more stone and fewer large beams, or reuses older timbers scavenged from abandoned structures. You see communities building in places where natural alcoves reduce the need for elaborate roofing. But all of those are strategies inside a tightening resource bottleneck. More mouths in a canyon mean more fields scraped onto slopes, more juniper and pinyon cut for fuel, more brush cleared for visibility and defense, more animal browse nibbling at already stressed vegetation. Landscape management can hold the line for a while. Terracing here, check dams there, communal rules about when you cut and where you plant. But it has limits when the underlying conditions keep ratcheting toward drier and colder, and when population has been building up for generations. Once you start running out of easy fuel and nearby fertile soil, something else changes. Distance. The good wood might now be a full day's walk away. The only uncultivated bottomland might be in a neighbouring drainage that another community already claims. A spring that used to supply 2 villages may now be barely enough for one. Every extra mile someone walks to gather fuel or find a new planting spot is time they're not spending on maintenance, childcare, or watching the horizon for trouble. And the further people have to range from home, the more often they cross boundaries, formal or informal, hunting territories, timber zones, fallow fields someone else is eyeing for the next planting season. When surplus shrinks and access narrows, a dispute that might have been solved with gifts or shared feasts in better times becomes a flashpoint. A field trampled by another group's animals, a stand of trees cut on the wrong side of a ridge, a spring visited by people your leaders don't fully trust. Each of those encounters has higher stakes when everyone is closer to the edge. All of this is why archaeologists and descendant communities increasingly talk about environment as something shaped, not just suffered. The climate in the 1200s mattered, but how people farmed, where they cut wood, how much they invested in terraces and check dams, how long they stayed in one place before moving, whether they shared or defended key patches, those were choices. Sometimes they were smart, adaptive choices that brought another generation of viability in a hard place. Sometimes they locked communities into layouts and habits that were difficult to unwind once conditions worsened. By the time the Great Drought hit, the land around many of these villages wasn't some untouched backdrop suddenly struck by bad weather. It was a human-made landscape carrying the memory of centuries of use. So when the sky turned stingy, it wasn't just less rain. It was less rain falling on thinner soil, patchier forests, longer supply lines, and communities already squeezed into the best remaining pockets. In that kind of world, the question stops being simply, will it rain, and becomes, given what we've already done to this place, what does even a good rain buy us now, and for how much longer? When landscapes tighten like that, people don't just bump elbows over fields and firewood. They start bumping into each other in ways that leave scars we can still see. Archaeologists are cautious about calling anything warfare, but there are certain patterns that make people pause. Skeletons with healed fractures on forearms, the kind you get from trying to block a blow. Skulls with sharp force trauma, arrow points still lodged between ribs, or cut marks that may indicate scalping or other post-mortem treatment. Burials that don't look like careful ceremonial interments, but hurried deposits in kivas or abandoned rooms, bodies jumbled together. Then there are the buildings. Some pueblos show episodes of intense burning that don't match the slow, sagging collapse of a cooking fire gone wrong. Roofs charred and then fallen inward, multiple rooms blackened in a way that suggests coordinated destruction. In other places you see doors sealed up, entryways narrowed, walls thickened, parapets added on the edges of roofs. Stairways that once would have been open become hidden internal routes, ladders are pulled inside, and most obvious of all, where people choose to live. Across the northern southwest in the late 1200s, you see a dramatic shift into places that are, frankly, a pain to get to. Cliff dwellings tucked high in canyon walls, pueblos perched on steep mesa tops, with sheer drop-offs on 3 sides and only 1 or 2 narrow approaches. Villages clustered tightly on promontories that command long views down valley. These are not the locations you pick if day-to-day convenience is your only concern. They're positions you pick if you're thinking hard about who can see you, who can get to you, and how fast you can pull up the metaphorical ladder. At the same time, many of these sites are getting bigger. Earlier in the sequence, you might have lots of smaller hamlets and farmsteads scattered along a drainage, with people fanning out across the fields. By the 13th century, more and more households are packing into aggregated pueblos with hundreds of rooms, dozens of kivas, and a fairly sharp boundary between inside and out. That kind of aggregation can mean many things: denser social life, more labour for big projects, richer ritual calendars, But in a world where resources are stressed and distant, it can also be a security strategy. It's easier to defend one large, well-placed village than 10 tiny scattered ones. It's easier to maintain watch, to organize patrols, to sound an alarm. Walls that in one century mainly hold up roofs can, in another, start to feel like fortifications. What exactly were people defending against? That's where the debate gets lively, and where simple answers start to fall apart. Some researchers lean toward raiding, organized small-scale attacks aimed at capturing food, animals, or people during lean times. Others emphasize local feuds that might flare over land, marriages, or old grievances, smouldering for generations and then boiling over when drought turns everyone's margin for error to zero. There are arguments that we're seeing the social fabric itself fraying, alliances breaking down, leaders losing credibility, disputes no longer easily smoothed over with feasting and ritual. There's also the possibility that we're watching political realignment, some communities clustering into defensive confederations, others being pushed out or absorbed. A burned village in one valley might not signal random chaos, but a deliberate act in a struggle over who controls the remaining good fields, the key springs, the main travel corridors. All of those interpretations are shaped by our own expectations about what violence should look like. And this is where ethics come in. It's easy, from a distance of 700 years, to turn cliff dwellings into a backdrop for dramatic last stand stories, or to talk about collapse, as if complex living societies simply devolved into endless bloodshed. That kind of storytelling might be gripping, but it flattens real people into caricatures. Helpless victims or ruthless warriors, nothing in between. Descendant communities whose ancestors built and lived in these places are very clear that their history is not just a string of massacres and disappearances. The same centuries that show trauma on some skeletons and charred beams in some rooms also show exquisite pottery, intricate turquoise mosaics, careful farming infrastructure, and elaborate ceremonial spaces. People loved, negotiated, raised children, told stories, made hard decisions. Violence and fear were part of that world, but not the whole of it. Still, fear matters when we ask why whole regions empty out. If you're living in a canyon where the best soil is already thin, the wood is far, the rain is unreliable, and you've heard, first-hand, not as legend, about nearby villages that burned, your risk calculations change. A distant cousin in another valley offering space in a larger pueblo, closer to allies, and perched in a more defensible spot, suddenly looks less like an inconvenience and more like a lifeline. In that sense, insecurity wasn't just about the moment of a raid or a skirmish, it was a background condition, a low hum of risk that made staying put feel less and less wise. As alliances shifted and rumours travelled along the same paths as pottery and corn, people could read the map. Some places were becoming safer, more connected, others were becoming exposed. When we look at the late 1200s through that lens, the abandonment of so many northern pueblos doesn't have to mean that everything failed. It can also mean that people were choosing, proactively, to move toward thicker networks of mutual defence and support, toward places where the walls, the numbers, and the relationships felt strong enough to face whatever the sky and the neighbours might bring next. Living behind thicker walls with more neighbours solves some problems, it creates others. When a settlement grows from a cluster of related households into a village with a few hundred, or even 1,000 people, daily life gets more complicated. Who decides when to plant, when to harvest, and how to coordinate the labour? Who speaks for the village in disputes with the next canyon over? Who has the authority to tell one lineage, "No, you can't move your fields there," or another, "Yes, you have to help repair that reservoir even if you're tired and your own roof is leaking"? Those aren't abstract questions. They're the kinds of decisions that leave material traces. In some late pueblos, you see suites of rooms that are unusually big, unusually well built, or stocked with higher-end goods. Polished black-on-white pottery, turquoise ornaments, imported shells. Storage rooms nearby hold more maize than an average household could reasonably eat. That pattern suggests some people had easier access to surplus or more control over how it moved. You also see things like great kivas being remodeled, blocked off, or replaced with different kinds of community spaces. Kivas filled in and built over. New plazas that seem designed to gather larger groups at once. Those shifts can signal changes in who is organising ceremonial life, who is hosting feasts, whose calendar matters for everyone else. Archaeologists are careful not to turn every big room into a palace, or every unusual burial into a king. But taken together, these patterns look a lot like ongoing negotiation over authority. Leadership in Pueblo societies has long been more about persuasion, ritual responsibility and lineage than about thrones and crowns. Even so, when resources tighten and villages aggregate, the stakes of leadership rise. If your village has to decide whether to welcome a wave of incoming relatives from a failing valley, someone has to argue for or against it. If there isn't enough water in the spring for everyone to plant on the same schedule, someone's fields go first and someone's wait. Those choices can create factions. We see hints of that in how some buildings are remodeled. Doorways between certain room blocks are sealed. New walls cut across older alignments, carving what had been a more open pattern of movement into a series of more self-contained clusters. It's as if segments within the village are drawing sharper boundaries, defining our side and their side, not just socially but in adobe and stone. Stress from drought or conflict doesn't push every community in the same direction. Sometimes it leads to more centralization. People pull together, accept stronger leaders, concentrate food in communal stores, and invest heavily in big communal spaces where decisions can be negotiated. Archaeologists call this aggregation, and in the 13th century Southwest there's plenty of it. But the same stress can also pull people apart. If you feel that the decisions made in the Great Kiva or the Plaza consistently favor another lineage, you might start skipping public rituals. If your obligations to work on communal projects feel endless, while your own hearth goes cold, resentment builds. There are sites where rooms at the edges of pueblos are left empty while the core is still occupied, or where some families seem to have left earlier than others, taking their portable belongings but leaving behind the heavy infrastructure of community life. Politics, in that sense, becomes another push factor. For some, moving to a larger centre might have been appealing precisely because it promised a more robust leadership structure, more allies, more elaborate ritual to bind people together. For others, the attraction lay in the opposite direction, joining smaller kin-based settlements, where you owe duties mostly to relatives who shared your obligations and your history, not to a complex web of office holders and ritual societies. And then there is the burden of success. Big communities often build big projects, reservoirs, terraces, great houses, ceremonial complexes. Maintaining those takes coordinated labour year after year. In prosperous times, hosting a feast in a large kiva or plaza is a chance to display generosity and reinforce alliances. In lean times, the expectation to provide corn, turkeys, or labour for community events can feel like a tax you can't afford. Walking away from that isn't always a desperate last resort. It can be a political decision. If a group feels sidelined in village councils, or if a younger generation disagrees with how elders are handling threats and alliances, one option is to split. People might follow a respected ritual leader to found a new settlement closer to allies downriver. Or they might accept invitations from relatives in regions where leadership feels more trustworthy, where obligations seem more balanced with benefits. Centuries later, when archaeologists map out these movements, what they see is a pattern of sites that suddenly go quiet. A once bustling pueblo shows almost no trash from the final years, no rebuilding of key structures, rooms left clean rather than smashed. From a distance, that looks like a mysterious disappearance. But from the inside, it may have looked like a community working through the limits of how big, how centralized, and how unequal their world could become before the costs outweighed the protection. Politics doesn't fossilize neatly. It surfaces as a burned kiva here, a sealed doorway there, a shift from one kind of public space to another. In the story of the northern Southwest's emptying, those faint traces of argument and reorganization matter. They suggest that people weren't simply swept off the map by drought or violence alone. They were also making choices about what kind of community they wanted to live in, and when that stopped feeling possible, where else they might go. When a village decides where else might be, it doesn't spin the answer out of nowhere. It looks outward along the lines that already connect it to other people. In the northern Southwest, those lines weren't just dusty footpaths between neighbours. They were trade routes stretching hundreds of miles, carrying not only food when times allowed, but stories, marriages, ornaments, ritual knowledge, and news of who was thriving and who was barely hanging on. For centuries before the Great Abandonment, communities had been plugged into a wider world. Turquoise from local mines travelled out. Brilliant scarlet macaws and copper bells travelled in from far to the south. Shells from the Pacific and the Gulf of California made their way inland, eventually turning up in cliff dwellings and mesa-top rooms. Pottery styles hopped from valley to valley. Ideas about how to lay out plazas, how to build kivas, even how to schedule ceremonies moved along with them. Those exotic things, the macaws, the shells, the especially fine black-on-white bowls, weren't just status symbols, they were tokens of relationship. If your village had a room with a cache of turquoise and imported ornaments, it meant you had partners far away. Someone out there owed you favours. Someone out there expected you to keep your end of the exchange going. In a good year, when harvest was solid across the region, that network could be a luxury, a way to show off at feasts, to dress dancers in feathers and jewellery that made a statement. In a bad year, it could become a lifeline. Imagine a canyon settlement hit harder by drought than its neighbours. If people downriver had a slightly better harvest, they might trade surplus maize or squash for turquoise, pottery, or labour. If a village near a permanent spring had strong ties to more marginal communities, those ties might translate into temporary refuge or shared planting rights. Trade and alliance blurred into one another. But what happens when those long-distance routes grow dangerous, or simply less reliable? If conflict spikes along part of a river corridor, suddenly a journey that used to take a few days and a handful of friendly visits might mean skirting hostile territory. If a powerful centre that once anchored exchange, like Chaco Canyon earlier, or later great pueblos in the Rio Grande or the Mogollon Rim, begins to weaken, the web of relationships around it slackens too. Promises made at its great kivas become harder to keep. For people living in the northern San Juan region in the 13th century, there are signs that the routes they depended on were shifting under their feet. Some trade goods that had once been common begin to appear less frequently. Others, from different directions, become more visible. It's as if the compass of connection is slowly turning. Archaeologists see this in the material fingerprints that different regions leave on each other. Clay from one river valley fires to a particular colour and texture. Designs painted by potters in another follow their own conventions. When a village suddenly has a lot of imported ceramics, bowls and jars clearly made in a distant style, you know its residents were in close contact with that source region, either through regular trade or through migrating families bringing their household goods with them. The same goes for stone. Tools made from obsidian can be chemically traced back to specific volcanic flows. Chert and other toolstone often come from known quarries. When the proportion of local versus imported stone in a community's toolkit changes, it maps a quiet reorientation in where people travel, whom they visit, and whom they trust. In the late 1200s, as northern pueblos empty, you start to see more northern-style pottery and ornaments showing up far to the south. Designs, construction techniques, even the ways people finish the rims of pots migrate into new regions. It isn't just a matter of gifts sent ahead. It looks like whole communities with their habits and aesthetics, plugging themselves into different networks. From the inside, this might have been framed less as abandoning a homeland, and more as following the lines that still hold. If your old partners upriver can no longer spare grain, but your relatives on the Rio Grande are building new plaza-centered towns and promise shared fields, the rational place to be is where exchange still works. Shifting trade networks are both symptom and cause here. They're a symptom because when climate stress and political tension ripple through a region, the first things to wobble are the long, thin connections. A dangerous pass doesn't get used. A distant feast gets skipped. A ceremonial circuit that once took you past half a dozen allied villages now feels too risky to complete. The archaeological record registers that as fewer imported pots, fewer exotic items, a more local look to people's belongings. But they're also a cause, because who you can count on shapes where you want to live. As new centres rise, places in the south or east that seem to have more secure water, stronger leadership and fresh ritual energy, they begin to pull people toward them. Trade goods flow that way, and then, increasingly, so do people. A family in a cliff dwelling might hear that a cousin has married into a thriving village along a different river, one where macaws still screech in ceremonial rooms and shells still rattle in dancers' hands. Over the years, the prestige of that place grows. So does the sense that the old roots to your current home are fraying. Staying put starts to feel less like loyalty and more like isolation. By the time a settlement finally goes quiet, its trade connections may have already been rewired for a generation. The turquoise that once flowed north now moves east. The ceramic styles that once signaled membership in one regional community have been reinterpreted, combined with new influences further away. The lifelines have shifted, and the people have shifted with them. From our vantage point, we see that as a pattern of imports and exports changing on a map. From theirs, it would have felt like following the strongest threads of relationship, obligation, and opportunity left in a world where older anchors were failing. When you look at it that way, the empty rooms in Mesa Verde or Kayenta are not just evidence of collapse. They're also the shadows of a new geography of connection, one that drew people toward different centers of gravity, where new rituals were being held, new alliances forged, and old stories retold to fit a landscape that had quite literally moved beneath their feet. If you lived in one of these pueblos, the most important architecture in your world might not have been the rooms you slept in. It was the spaces where you met the unseen. Archaeologists catch glimpses of that world in the same way they see trade and farming, through what people built and what they left behind. Circular, often semi-subterranean rooms, kivas, anchor many ancestral Puebloan settlements. They aren't just basements. They're benches, wall niches, central fire pits, roof openings, and sipapus, small holes in the floor symbolizing emergence from an earlier world, speak to ritual choreography and deep stories about origins. Plazas are another clue. Broad open spaces framed by room blocks and great kivas weren't efficient choices if the only goal was shelter. They were stages for gatherings, dances, feasts, storytelling, ceremonies that tied scattered households into a single we. Iconography echoes this ritual life. Painted designs on pottery, carved petroglyphs on canyon walls, figurines, and carved wooden or bone objects all carry recurring motifs, spirals, rain clouds, birds, Katsina-like beings. We can't translate them line by line, but their repetition suggests a shared symbolic language about water, fertility, ancestors, and powerful non-human beings. Even the way objects enter the ground is part of the story. Archaeologists talk about deposition practices, how items end up where we find them. Some rooms contain deliberate caches, carefully arranged turquoise beads, special pots, groundstone tools placed in corners or under floors. Burials appear under kiva floors or in specific room types, accompanied by carefully chosen offerings. These aren't random losses, they're patterned acts loaded with meaning. Once you start to see that patterning in life, you notice it in how people left. Not every abandoned room is a scene of chaos. In some places there are hints of cleaning and sorting before departure. Useful tools are taken, others are left in what look like deliberate deposits. Entrances are sealed. Kivas are filled in. In a few cases, structures show burning patterns that look more like controlled fires than accidental blazes. Roofs burned and collapsed while walls remain standing, with special objects placed beneath. Some archaeologists interpret these as closing rituals, the ceremonial deactivation of a place. Around the world, societies have traditions of ending the life of a house, a shrine, or even an entire village. You might burn a building to send its essence back to the spirits who first granted it. You might seal a doorway with stones so that dangerous forces or offended ancestors can't wander out. You might leave offerings in a hearth or at a kiva's sipapu to mark a respectful farewell. It's possible that at least some southwestern departures followed that logic. Instead of a panicked flight in the night, imagine a decision made weeks or months in advance. Elders consult ritual calendars, watch the movements of the sun and stars, review prophecies or long-told narratives about cycles of emergence and migration. Maybe there's a story that says, when the rains fail like this, when enemies press from that direction, when the ceremonies no longer work, it is time to move on and renew the world elsewhere. In that frame, migration is not just survival strategy. It's a religious duty and a chance for renewal. Certain dates in ritual calendars, solstices, equinoxes, the completion of multi-year ceremonial cycles, might have been seen as especially powerful moments to undertake big changes. Leaving a great house or a cliff dwelling on such a day would fold the departure into cosmic order. You aren't just walking away from home, you're stepping into the next chapter of a story your people have always known they're part of. Those closing acts, burning, sealing, dedicating, don't point to a single motive. They could coexist with fear of attack, with grinding hunger, with frustration at political leaders. A community might be losing faith in its current arrangement, while still believing deeply in its gods, its ancestors, its obligation to keep ceremonies going somewhere. Belief systems shape how people interpret stress. A drought might not just be bad weather. It could be a sign that rituals have been neglected, that social harmony is fractured, that certain taboos have been broken. Conflict on the horizon might be read as the fulfillment of an old warning. Even the faltering of trade networks could be framed as the withdrawal of spiritual favor from a once sacred center. In that context, staying put in a failing place is not neutral. It might feel like complicity in a ritual misalignment that is dragging the whole community down. Moving toward a region where new plazas are going up, where great kivas are fresh, where leaders promise more powerful ceremonies, can be both practical strategy and spiritual correction. From the outside, centuries later, we tally climate curves and map population shifts. From the inside, choices about leaving or staying would have been entangled with prayers, omens, and stories about what the world itself was asking for. The last days in a village might have been marked less by frantic packing and more by processions, songs, and offerings. Rooms closed in order, kivas ritually killed, sacred objects buried or carried, depending on whether their power belonged to that specific place or to the people as a whole. When you think about it that way, the empty cliff dwellings and mesa-top towns aren't just abandoned real estate. They're former ritual landscapes that were consciously wound down, their spiritual accounts closed, so that their inhabitants could seek balance and blessing somewhere else. Which brings us to the hardest question to shake. If these were planned departures guided by belief as much as by hunger or fear, where exactly did they go? They didn't vanish into thin air. They moved into other people's maps. For a long time, textbooks and popular stories suggested a tidy cliffhanger. The Anasazi disappear from places like Mesa Verde and Chaco Canyon, and scene, curtain drops, mystery. But if you zoom out in space and time, the ruins don't look like an ending. They look like a bend in the river. Archaeologists can trace the broad currents of that bend. One big stream flows east, toward the Rio Grande Valley in what's now New Mexico. Another turns west and north, toward the Hopi Mesas. Another heads south and west into what's now the Zuni region and the Mogollon Rim country. Smaller eddies lead into parts of Arizona, Utah, and beyond. Those destination areas are not random dots. They cluster along more reliable rivers and springs, along big floodplains and defensible ridges, in places with longer growing seasons or better odds of surviving a string of bad years. This is where push and pull come together. On the push side, people are leaving what archaeologists call marginal zones, high, cold mesas, dry uplands where a few bad drought years can mean crop failure across an entire valley, areas where forests have been heavily logged for construction and firewood, where soils have been worked hard, where nearby allies might be too few or too far away. On the pull side, people are drawn to corridors of dependable water, to broad bottomlands that can be irrigated or flood-farmed even when rainfall falters, and to regions with denser, more connected populations. Allies matter. If your village is down to a few dozen households clinging to a slope, the chance to join hundreds of people along the Rio Grande, sharing labor, sharing food, sharing defense, starts to look less like abandoning home and more like choosing a future. None of this is guesswork in the sense of pure imagination. It's inference built on patterns, and those patterns stack up from multiple directions. Architecture is one of the clearest signals. When migrants move, they often bring their building habits with them. In the 13th century, you see certain masonry styles, certain ways of arranging room blocks and kivas appear in new regions, almost like a signature. A plaza layout or a kiva form that used to be typical in one canyon suddenly shows up hundreds of kilometers away, layered onto older local traditions. Pottery tells a similar story. Clay recipes, paint styles, preferred shapes for cooking jars and serving bowls, these are all cultural habits learned in childhood. When a village that used to make one kind of black-on-white painted pottery declines, and a village far away suddenly has a lot of that style mixed into its trash heaps, it suggests people, not just pots, have moved. Settlement patterns add another clue. You can see clusters of small dispersed hamlets in one region thinning out over a few decades, while major pueblos in another region grow rapidly and remodel to accommodate more households. That expansion isn't just natural population growth. The timing lines up with declines elsewhere. In recent decades, genetics has entered the toolkit, but with a lot of caution. Ancient DNA is hard to recover in this environment, and ethical questions around sampling ancestral remains are serious. Where data do exist, some studies suggest continuity between ancient populations in the Four Corners and later Pueblo groups along the Rio Grande and on the Hopi Mesas. It's a faint, complicated signal, but it aligns with what other lines of evidence already imply. And then there are the stories people tell about themselves. Many Pueblo communities today, Hopi, Zuni, Keres, Tewa, Tiwa, Toa speakers and others, have migration narratives. These aren't neat GPS tracks, and they're not meant to be. They're sacred histories describing journeys from earlier homelands, with stops at particular mountains, springs, and ancient pueblos along the way. Some of those waypoints line up strikingly with archaeological sites. Names used in oral histories echo place names archaeologists have pulled from Spanish documents or inscriptions on rock. All of this points toward a core idea. The people who built cliff dwellings and great houses didn't disappear. Their descendants are among the living Pueblo communities of the Southwest. But that doesn't mean the destinations were empty waiting rooms. When migrants arrived along the Rio Grande or at the Hopi Mesas or in the Zuni area, they were stepping into landscapes already inhabited. Farming villages had been there for generations, ritual cycles were already turning, local lineages already claimed particular fields, springs, shrines. So the story is not one of replacement, it's one of integration and negotiation. You can see it in hybrid architectures where an incoming masonry style wraps around older room blocks, in pottery assemblages where local and migrant traditions coexist for a while, then blend into new, regionally distinct designs. In multi-story pueblos where internal room clusters hint at formerly separate groups now living cheek by jowl, each with their own kiva or plaza niche. Those processes likely came with tension. Who gets which fields? Whose ceremonial calendar takes precedence? Which origin story explains the village as a whole? But they also came with opportunities. More hands for irrigation works, more warriors for defense, more specialists for ritual life, more marriage partners binding groups together. And it's crucial to see this as waves, not a single march. The abandonment of the Four Corners isn't a one-summer evacuation. In some areas, populations begin thinning out in the late 1100s. In others, the big pulse of departures hits in the 1200s. A few pockets hang on into the early 1300s. Families might move twice or 3 times in a generation. Down canyon to a better spring, then farther east toward a growing centre, then again to join relatives or follow a ritual obligation. From the ground in those years, it wouldn't have felt like one epic exodus. It would have felt like a long era of restlessness. Neighbours leaving, strangers arriving, new plazas being built even as old towers hollowed out, paths crossing and recrossing as people tried to find a place where fields, friends and spirits all lined up again. If you could watch a time-lapse map of the region, it would look less like a lights-out moment and more like a slow, shimmering migration of villages toward a new set of anchors on the landscape. Anchors that, in many cases, are still occupied today. And inside that flow, every household carried decisions. What to bring, what to bury, who to join, who to leave, and how to make a home in a place that was already someone else's home. When archaeologists walk through those empty rooms, they're not just cataloguing artifacts. They're trying to read decisions in what was left behind. Take the everyday stuff. Cooking pots cracked from use but still repairable. Grinding stones worn down but not useless. Baskets, spindle whirls, half-finished tools. It can feel like people dropped everything and ran. But left behind is not a simple category. If you're planning to move, you triage. Heavy grinding stones that cost more in effort to carry than to remake might be left on the floor. Big storage jars can be abandoned if they're easy to replicate, and the clay source is common. Broken tools that would have been fixed if you were staying become not worth the trouble. Later visitors add another layer. A site that sits empty in a populated landscape is a hardware store. People come back to strip beams for firewood, haul off usable stone, collect pots that aren't cracked, rummage through storage rooms for grain. What looks like a snapshot of a sudden departure might actually be a house that was cleaned out, then picked over again and again. Archaeologists see this in the patterning. Rooms where valuables and portable goods are systematically gone suggest either an organised departure or thorough later scavenging. Rooms where odd things are still there, ornaments, grinding stones, rare imported pottery, might point to a faster, more chaotic leaving or to social rules that made some items inappropriate to reuse. And sometimes, the things left behind don't look like accidents at all. They look like offerings, intact vessels inverted over a hearth, special objects placed in corners, under doorways, in kivas. Those can mark closure rituals, people intentionally giving the space back, not just walking away from it. Fire adds another kind of signal and another set of arguments. In some pueblos there are distinct burn layers, rooms with roofs collapsed in flames, walls reddened from intense heat, floors baked and littered with carbonized beams. That can mean violent attack, enemies torching a village. Some sites do show arrow points embedded in walls, hastily constructed defences, signs of trauma on human remains. The story there might well include raids or sieges, but burning a building doesn't always mean war. In many parts of the world, people deliberately burn houses when they're finished with them, especially if the house has ceremonial weight. A final fire can kill a structure, release its spirit, or mark the end of a lineage's use of that space. In the southwest, some burned rooms contain carefully placed offerings beneath the ash, or signs that valuables were removed before the fire. Those look more like planned closure than surprise attack. And then there are accidental fires. Kids, cooking, lightning, sparks. Especially in dense pueblos full of timber and thatch. One roof catches, embers jump, and an entire block can go up in an afternoon without any invading army in sight. Sorting those possibilities out means looking closely at what burned, what didn't, and what was done afterward. Construction tells its own half-finished stories. Archaeologists see towers that only reached a second story, room blocks with foundations in place but walls barely waist high, kivas started but never roofed. On paper, it reads as an abrupt halt. A building project abandoned midstream. In real time, that could mean a lot of things. Maybe the community hit a labour bottleneck. Too few able-bodied adults, too many other crises. Maybe a series of bad harvests made investing in a big new ceremonial building feel irresponsible. Maybe a faction split off and left before their part of the village was complete. Or maybe construction simply shifted priorities. You start a big extension when times look promising, then redirect effort to defending existing rooms, expanding storage, or moving fields. To future archaeologists with radiocarbon dates instead of memories, that pivot looks like a sharp stop, even if on the ground it unfolded over several planting seasons. Timing is where everything starts to look overnight. When researchers date beams from roofs, charred corn cobs from hearths, or soot on kiva ceilings, a lot of the latest dates in the northern southwest cluster in a narrow window, roughly 1275 to 1300. In graphs and charts, you see these elegant spikes, lots of last-use dates piling up just before 1300, then a steep drop. From the 21st century, that pattern is tempting to read as a single moment. Lights on, lights off. But dating methods have their own quirks. Tree ring dates are tied to cutting and use. They tell you the last growth year of that timber, not the day the family left. Radiocarbon clusters because of sampling. Researchers often target final use context on purpose, so the graph is already biased toward endings. A sharp transition on a chart might actually represent 2 or 3 generations of neighbours drifting away, one household at a time, and those charts don't always tell the same story. Architecture might show big pueblos hollowing out rapidly in the late 1200s, while pottery styles suggest gradual turnover and continued low-level activity into the early 1300s. Paleo-environmental data, tree rings, lake sediments, pack rat middens, trace drought cycles that peak at slightly different moments depending on where you look. One canyon might show intense stress by 1275. Another, more buffered, might not hit its breaking point until decades later. Overlay migration evidence, and the picture becomes even more textured. Some regions show a clean handoff, local villages declining as distant centres grow. In others, you see overlapping phases, people arriving even as construction slows, new ritual spaces appearing inside old shells. This is why archaeologists argue so fiercely about what happened. The ruins don't whisper a single storyline. They murmur different possibilities depending on which signals you weight most. The hurriedly abandoned room, the ritually burned kiva, the wall that never rose past a man's shoulder, the date on the last tree ring in a roof beam. Threaded together, they point toward a time of mounting strain and repeated choices rather than one sudden cinematic flight. But how exactly those choices felt, and which pressures mattered most in each village, is still up for debate, which is where the big competing theories come in. Some of the loudest explanations for this period survive not because they're strong, but because they're simple. One of the most stubborn ideas is the instant vanishing act, the notion that everyone in the northern southwest just disappeared one season, like a switch was flipped. From a distance, the timelines we talked about can look like that. Final tree ring dates cluster, construction stops, big centres empty out. But when you zoom in, that sharp edge crumbles. You see decades of thinning populations, houses reused and reconfigured, small sites lingering on after nearby neighbours have gone quiet. You see evidence of movement, pottery styles, architecture, genetic signals that ties the people of these abandoned cities to later communities farther south and east. They don't vanish. They relocate, merge, reorganize. Overnight is mostly an illusion created by our tools and our desire for a dramatic ending. Then there's the truly durable favourite, aliens, or some other supernatural intervention. From a scientific perspective, that idea collapses almost immediately. The material record from the 13th century looks like human history everywhere else. Gradual change in pottery recipes and designs, evolving architecture that builds on local traditions, farming patterns that respond to water and soil, signs of conflict that fit what you'd expect in a stressed, densely occupied landscape. No sudden injection of unfamiliar technology, no out-of-place metals, no bodies with strange anatomy. Just people doing the messy, improvisational things people do. The alien narrative survives not because the ruins demand it, but because the ruins are photogenic. Cliff dwellings perched under overhangs, great houses aligned to solstices, roads pointing straight line across rough terrain. Those images feel mysterious, especially if you're not familiar with indigenous engineering, astronomy and landscape knowledge. It's easier and more exotic to imagine wisdom descending from the sky than to recognize it as the accumulated skill of local farmers, builders and ritual specialists over centuries. And then there's the single cause story. It was the drought, or it was warfare, or it was religious fanaticism, pick one. Each of those has some footing in the evidence. There was serious drought. There were episodes of violence. Ritual life clearly mattered. The problem is not that they're wrong, but that none of them, by itself, is enough. Regions hit hard by drought sometimes hang on longer than better-watered neighbours. Some places with big defensive works don't show many signs of actual battle. Elaborate ceremonial centres sometimes continue in use after nearby farmsteads have been abandoned. The map is patchy in ways that one big hammer can't flatten into a single, clean cause. So why do these theories, instant departure, otherworldly visitors, one smoking gun, keep resurfacing? Part of it is the gaps. We don't have diaries from 1287. We have no speeches, no treaties, no personal letters from someone explaining why their family decided not to plant another field that spring. Into that silence, our brains pour narratives that fit modern expectations. Catastrophe, heroes and villains, sudden twists. Part of it is the visuals. A cliff palace emptied but intact looks like a frozen moment, even if the actual leaving was staggered and complex. A burned kiva looks like a single violent night, even if the fire was a planned closure. Clean dramatic images invite clean dramatic explanations, and part of it is that simple stories are easier to tell. They left because of the drought fits in a headline. It's digestible in a TV segment or a social media post. A web of interacting pressures, soil fatigue, forest depletion, shifting trade routes, political fragmentation, religious realignment, multi-year drought layered over decades of marginal harvests, is harder to compress into a single sentence, even if it matches the evidence better. Mainstream archaeology hasn't always resisted those simplifications. Early work leaned hard on environmental determinism. Climate changed, people moved, end of story. Later, some researchers swung towards social explanations. Factionalism, ideology, leadership failures. Over the past few decades, the strongest interpretations have tried to braid those strands together. They see drought not as an on-off switch, but as a stress test on already strained systems. They read fortifications and trauma as signs that scarcity sometimes spilled into violence without assuming a permanent state of war. They interpret new ceremonial structures and shifts in ritual paraphernalia as responses to uncertainty, ways communities tried to make sense of and maybe influence what was happening. Those interpretations are not free-for-alls. They're constrained by what's actually in the ground. We don't know the exact sequence of events in every village. We don't know precisely how people weighed risk or hope when they decided to stay one more year or finally leave. We're uncertain about the relative importance of each factor. How much did failing crops matter compared to fraying alliances or troubling omens? But some things are not blank spaces. We know people didn't literally vanish. They show up in descendant communities' oral histories and in later archaeological traditions. We know climate alone can't explain the patchwork of when and where sites were left. We know there's no physical support for an extraterrestrial or lost continent intervention. We know the timing of departures overlaps with clear signs of environmental strain, demographic crowding, political complexity, and shifting ritual landscapes. The approach running through this whole story is to treat the so-called mystery like any other human problem. Assume multiple causes, test each one against specific lines of evidence, and accept that different valleys, mesas, and canyons may have tipped for different primary reasons. What's left is not a single, tidy reveal, but a bounded set of possibilities. The civilization that abandoned its cities overnight likely did something more human and more familiar. It adapted, fragmented, and moved under pressures that built over generations, pressures we can trace, even if we can't reconstruct every conversation held around every hearth before the last door was closed. If you zoom out even farther in time, another piece snaps into place. For a lot of people, this isn't a mystery at all. Many Pueblo and Hopi communities today understand those 13th century migrations as part of their own history, not vaguely, not as a loose, maybe we're related idea, as a remembered, narrated, ceremonial reality. In oral traditions, people talk about emerging into this world, moving through different homelands and stopping in places you can point to on a modern map. The Chaco region, the Mesa Verde area, canyons and mesas all across what archaeologists call the northern southwest. They described leaving when it was time to leave, because water shifted, because obligations were fulfilled, because instructions were to keep moving until certain signs were met. Those aren't campfire ghost stories invented after archaeologists showed up. They're woven into clan histories, migration songs, ceremonial responsibilities, and relationships to specific springs, mesas, and shrines. They encode place-based knowledge where water can be found in a dry year, which soils will still bear corn after others fail, how to read the sky and the wind for coming change. From that perspective, the language outsiders often use, lost city, vanished civilization, disappeared people, isn't just inaccurate. It erases living descendants who have never stopped being here. Vanished makes it sound like a TV twist. One day there were people, the next there were none, roll credits. But you can visit Acoma, Zuni, Hopi, the Rio Grande Pueblos, and sit in communities whose ancestors helped build Chaco's great houses, farmed the mesas around Mesa Verde, climbed those ladders, walked those roads. You can hear stories that stretch from those cliff palaces to plazas that are still in use. So the question isn't what happened to them, as if they were fundamentally different from the people now. The better question is, how did communities change, move, and remake themselves across centuries? That shift in framing changes the work archaeologists do. For a long time, research in this region was carried out with minimal consultation with the tribes whose ancestors created the sites. Ruins were treated like abandoned stage sets, free to be excavated, collected from, and interpreted primarily through outside theories. Over the last few decades, that's been changing. Not perfectly, and not fast enough for many native communities, but significantly. Tribal historic preservation offices, cultural advisors and elders now regularly sit at the table with archaeologists and land managers. They weigh in on which sites are too sacred to disturb, which questions are appropriate to ask, which forms of analysis cross lines that shouldn't be crossed. Oral traditions are treated as lines of evidence, not curiosities. Researchers revise site interpretations after learning that what they thought was a storage room fits the description of a ritual space, or that a feature they considered unimportant is linked to a migration waypoint in community histories. Those collaborations don't hand over a neat, definitive answer to why people left certain cities, but they do change what counts as a good explanation. A theory that ignores descendant knowledge now looks as incomplete as one that ignores tree rings. They also highlight something that the word abandoned tends to hide, Landscapes can stay deeply in use even when the big architecture is no longer lived in every day. A canyon might lose its year-round household smoke and still host pilgrimages at certain times of year. A great kiva might be ritually closed, its roof allowed to fall in, while a nearby spring remains a place of prayer. A mesa-top village might be left as a residence but revisited as an ancestral place, a node in a spiritual geography that stretches over hundreds of miles. From the outside, that looks like an empty ruin. From the perspective of descendant communities, it can be more like an old family home that no one sleeps in anymore, but that still anchors reunions, stories, and obligations. When you start to see it that way, the story becomes less about disappearance and more about continuity through movement. People left some valleys and filled others. Clans split, rejoined, and adopted newcomers. Ritual knowledge moved with them, sometimes transforming along new rivers and new soils. Architectural styles shifted, pottery designs evolved, political structures reconfigured, but threads of language, ceremony, and worldview ran through those changes. The mystery, then, isn't where did they go, as if the trail just stops at a cliff edge. It's how, precisely, all those threads wove into the communities we see today. How specific lineages travelled, how decisions were made at each fork, which stresses mattered most in each canyon and mesa. For descendant peoples, that's not an unsolved puzzle to be gawked at. It's an ongoing relationship with ancestors and places. For researchers, it's a reminder that the most honest story we can tell is not about a broken line, but about a path that bends, branches, and keeps going. If you lay all those threads out in time, the mystery starts to look less like a single night when everyone blew out their lamps and more like a long, uneven tightening of a knot. Imagine being born into one of those cliffside communities in the late 1200s. Your grandparents remember years when the fields below the mesa were thick with corn and squash, when the springs ran strong all summer. Your parents talk about the first really hard drought as something that happened back then, a bad stretch you got through. By the time you're old enough to carry water, the bad years aren't isolated anymore. Tree rings and lake cores tell us that the climate swung between hard droughts and odd intense storms. From inside a household, that translates into something more immediate. You plant more cautiously, maybe in more places. You walk farther to gather wood because the nearest slopes have been cut over. Stored corn that used to be a comforting buffer is now counted and recounted. One failed harvest in a landscape full of safety nets is a problem. One failed harvest after years of scraping by. When your fields are already tired, your storage rooms are already half empty, and your neighbours are in the same situation. That's a tipping point. Those tipping points don't have to be dramatic. They can be as quiet as a council in a plaza that runs longer than usual, as tense as a disagreement over who gets to plant where, as subtle as a ritual that doesn't feel right because the spring it centres on has gone unreliable. And all the while, larger currents are running in the background. Old political arrangements that tied far-flung communities together, like the regional networks that once centred on Chaco, have been fraying for generations. People have already been experimenting with new alliances, new ceremonial centres, new ways of organising who owes what to whom. That means power is up for negotiation, which means conflict is more likely when times turn lean. Maybe you've heard about raids in the next canyon over, or seen smoke where there shouldn't be smoke. Maybe a relative who married into a village downriver shows up with stories about fortifications being added, about people sleeping closer together at night. Fear is also a resource pressure. When trust erodes, every decision gets heavier. None of this lands at once. There isn't a single council fire where everybody in the Four Corners area stands up and votes to leave. What happens instead is layered. In some places, the first response is to stretch the existing system. You terrace more slopes. You dig check dams to catch runoff. You thin out forests even more to clear new plots. You intensify ceremonies asking for rain, rededicating shrines and renewing obligations. In other places, or a few years later, that might not be enough. So someone suggests what would have sounded unthinkable to their grandparents: sending scouts. A small group goes out during a planting season, not to move yet, but to see. They follow remembered paths, visit distant kin, check old springs and fields their ancestors once used. They come back with news. There's still water flowing steadily 2 or 3 days' walk away. There's an open pocket of good soil near a river where relatives say they'd welcome you. That starts a new kind of planning. Extra corn isn't just stored for winter, it's set aside for travel, Tools are repaired with an eye toward portability. People quietly decide which sacred items can be moved, which must stay, and how to close a place ritually if you're not sure you'll be back soon. Leaving in that sense isn't panic, it's staged. A few families might go first, maybe those with the strongest connections to the destination community. If they settle in well, if the fields take, if the politics are workable, if ceremonies can be adapted, they become an anchor, a promise that there is a real alternative to hanging on in a tightening vice. Over the next seasons, others follow. Some households split, sending a son or daughter with the migrants while elders stay to maintain shrines, or simply because the effort of moving is too great. Some communities may never fully empty in a single moment. They thin, refill briefly, and thin again as people test different options. And those options aren't identical from valley to valley. One village might finally tip toward leaving after a particularly bad drought year stresses already marginal fields. Another might be holding on agriculturally but getting squeezed by conflict, choosing to relocate closer to allied groups. Somewhere else, ritual obligations, stories that say it is time to move on when certain signs appear, may weigh as heavily as any bean yield. That's why archaeologists see slightly different timelines in different places. Some centres are largely empty by the early 1200s, others peak later and then decline. Some show sharp signs of burning or hurried abandonment. Others look like they were wound down, with rooms cleaned out and structures carefully closed. From a distance, centuries later, it's tempting to compress all of that into a single dramatic departure. But when you line up the evidence, climate records, tree ring dates on beams, changing pottery styles, shifts in settlement patterns, descendant accounts, you get a more intricate picture. Drought matters, but it matters in landscapes where soils are already tired and forests already cut back. Resource strain matters, but it interacts with who controls access to water and how fairly people think that control is being exercised. Conflict matters, but it often flares where political authority is contested and where crowded, stressed communities are bumping against each other. Belief and ceremony matter, not as decoration, but as the frameworks people use to decide when a place is no longer appropriate to live in and where obligations call them next. Over decades, those pressures stack, amplify, and occasionally ease. In some years, staying still is the easier choice. In others, the calculus flips, and the risks of staying finally outweigh the risks of leaving. What happened around 1300, then, is less like an explosion and more like a regional reorganization that rippled outward at different speeds. Families and clans didn't walk off the stage and vanish. They moved to the Rio Grande, to the Little Colorado, to places that would become today's pueblos and Hopi mesas, carrying seeds, stories, and social ties with them. The answer behind the empty cliff dwellings and silent great houses isn't a single catastrophe waiting to be revealed. It's that, under the weight of drought, resource strain, conflict, shifting politics, and lived systems of belief, many communities gradually decided that their best future lay somewhere else, and then, step by step, made that future real. Even with that more complex picture in mind, there are places where the story still goes blurry. We can say that people thinned out their villages over years, that families left in stages, that pressures accumulated. But we don't yet know the exact sequences of moves in most places, who left first and who stayed to the end, whether some households tried to move twice or 3 times before landing where their descendants live today. How often a migration path was a straight line versus a series of side trips, dead ends, and returns. At the scale of a valley or a single village, our timeline can still have a frustrating fuzziness. Tree ring dates on wooden beams, radiocarbon dates on corn cobs and charcoal give us ranges. This room was used into the 1280s. That one probably wasn't occupied much past 1265. Stitching that into a narrative, a particular spring when a council finally agreed to leave, a particular autumn when a plaza went quiet, is where the uncertainty sits. It's the same with conflict. We can point to sites with burned rooms, bodies left unburied, fortifications built in haste. We can say, here, something violent happened, but we don't always know who was fighting whom, or exactly why. Was a burned great house the result of an outside raid? A feud between factions inside the same community? A final act of anger by people who felt betrayed by their leaders or their neighbours? Leadership itself is one of the biggest open questions. In some periods, we see strong hints of centralized power, large great houses, planned plazas, regional road systems. In others, things look more fragmented. But in the last century before 1300, it's hard to tell, place by place, whether decisions to leave were pushed by a small group of influential ritual leaders, debated among relatively equal households, or negotiated along kinship lines. We also don't fully understand the ritual motives behind some departures. There's evidence of kivas ceremonially closed, of shrines carefully decommissioned, of offerings left in places that weren't meant to be returned to. Oral histories from descendant communities sometimes speak of instructions given by powerful beings, of cycles that require moving on, of places visited for a time rather than claimed forever. Connecting those meanings precisely to this canyon or that mesa, this decade or that dry spell, is delicate work. It involves listening to living people whose sacred narratives are not just data points for someone else's mystery. What's changing now is how many different tools archaeologists, geologists, and descendant communities can bring to bear on those questions. Dating methods keep improving. Tree ring studies don't just say when a beam was cut. They can sometimes tell whether a building was repaired after a particular drought or abandoned abruptly in the middle of what should have been a good year. Radiocarbon techniques are being refined to narrow down ranges, so we can tell if certain moves happened within a generation rather than a loose half-century. Isotopes, the tiny chemical fingerprints locked into bones, teeth, and pottery, are another line of evidence. Water and soil from different regions carry slightly different signatures. If someone grew up drinking from springs on one plateau and then moved to a river valley hundreds of kilometers away, that pattern can, in some cases, be read in their teeth. If a pot fired near one village ends up in another, isotopes in its clay can sometimes trace that journey. Ancient DNA research, when it's done, adds yet another layer. Broad patterns of relatedness between communities, hints about how families were structured, how people married across regions. But that work comes with serious ethical questions. These are not just samples, they are the ancestors of living people. Many descendant communities set firm boundaries about whether their ancestors' remains can be disturbed at all, or how any study must be conducted. In recent years, more projects are being designed in collaboration with Pueblo and Hopi communities, or not done at all if consent isn't given. Remote sensing, like LiDAR and high-resolution satellite imagery, is quietly rewriting maps. It's showing us subtle field systems, roads, small sites in between the famous big ones. That helps fill in the gaps between known centres, revealing paths that might have linked cliff dwellings to lowland fields or later pueblos. And climate reconstructions keep sharpening. Better tree ring networks, sediment cores from more lakes, even cave deposits that track changes in rainfall, giving us a season-by-season sense of when the land turned particularly harsh. All of that feeds into how scholars test their ideas. Instead of asking, was it drought or warfare, in a broad, abstract way, they can build specific models. If drought was the key driver here, we should see abandonment right after these particular bad years. If conflict was primary there, we should see fortifications and trauma on remains before people leave. If ritual timing mattered, we might see departures aligning with certain cycles preserved in oral traditions. Those models can be wrong, and often are at first. That's normal. In deep history, certainty is rare. What archaeologists do is propose explanations, lay out what evidence would support or contradict each one, and then go looking. As new dates come in, as a new site is found, as a descendant community shares a story that shifts the frame, models get adjusted or abandoned. Which brings us back to that haunting phrase, abandoned overnight. It captures something real, the emotional shock of walking into an empty village where it's clear that life used to be rich and ordered. It reflects, in some cases, genuinely rapid local events. A burned room, a hurried departure, a season when a canyon suddenly feels different. But as a description of the whole region, it's a simplification. The actual story is a dramatic transition spread over decades, unevenly, with moments of panic and moments of careful planning. It's a region reorganizing itself under pressure, not a civilization vanishing in a single night. So with all of this on the table, the droughts, the resource strain, the conflicts, the shifting politics, the ritual obligations, and the tools we're using to untangle them, I'm curious where you land. Which explanation feels most convincing to you, and why? Do you see this story mainly as an environmental push, a political reshuffling, a religious turning point, or something else entirely? And how do you think we should balance the urge to solve a mystery with the responsibility to respect the living descendants of the people who made these places? Let me know what you think. So now we can circle back to that first image, a city stilled mid-gesture, doors open, hearths cold, everything waiting for people who never came back. When you hear abandoned overnight, it's easy to picture a single catastrophic moment. A siren, a stampede, a curtain dropping on an entire way of life. What the evidence actually gives us is stranger, and in some ways, more human. We see long droughts that turned farming from hard work into a gamble. Forests and soils pushed past what they could sustain, so each new year took more effort for less return. We see villages edging up onto ridges, building walls and towers, as fears about raids and conflict grew. We see regional powers like Chaco rising, casting a long shadow and then fading, leaving political vacuum and uncertainty behind. We see trade routes fraying in some directions and tightening in others, new centres in the Rio Grande and elsewhere becoming more attractive. We see ritual spaces carefully closed, shrines left with offerings that say, in effect, this chapter is finished. And we see decisions playing out unevenly, one canyon emptying fast, a mesa top thinning slowly, a river valley holding on a bit longer before finally letting go. Put together, it's not a single cause but a stack of pressures, some external, some internal, that made staying less viable, less meaningful than moving. Different communities weighted those pressures differently. For some, bad harvests might have been the breaking point. For others, conflict, failed leadership, or a sense that the sacred order of things required a new place. What doesn't fit the evidence is the idea of disappearance. The people who built those cliff dwellings and great houses did not vanish into thin air. They moved. They joined relatives. They helped found and grow the pueblos and communities whose descendants are still here. Languages changed. Ceremonies adapted. Stories remembered those old places not as lost worlds, but as stops along a much longer road. So when we stand in a quiet room from 1300, we're not looking at the end of a civilization. We're looking at a pause between sentences in a story that kept going. If you found this journey through that story thought-provoking, it helps a lot if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who loves deep history. And I'd love to keep the conversation going, so drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now, and let me know how this mystery looks to you after hearing the fuller picture.